Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Regaining Control of Microsoft Group Management. We've got a great group of industry experts here to discuss the challenges of group management and ways to help eliminate the chaos. So let's get started. I'm McKenna. I work alongside the Microsoft experts here at Cayosoft. Just a couple housekeeping items to get going before we jump into the presentation. First off, you'll notice your microphones are muted to make sure everyone has the optimal listening experience, but we do encourage you to ask any questions you have. So depending on how you join today, either in browser or through the app, you'll see a question or chat section in your meeting dashboard. Feel free to drop your questions in there and we'll do our best to answer them. If we run short on time today, don't worry, we'll reach out to you individually to follow up. While you're in your meeting dashboard, be sure to also check out the handout section. We've included some additional resources there that you can download and also share with your team. This session will be recorded and we'll make sure to send you a link in the days following. And at the end of the presentation, we'll also be sharing some quick links for our contact info. If you have any additional questions or you're watching this on demand, please feel free to reach out to us. At the end of the presentation, we'll also be drawing one lucky winner of a $50 Amazon gift card. Of course, that's for our live viewers, not the on-demand. So make sure you stay on the line until the end as we draw from the list of those present at the time. Now that we've taken care of that, let's go ahead and jump right in. As I said earlier, we've got a great group of experts here today to talk about their vast tenures in the Microsoft space. I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker. With us today, we have founder of Cayosoft, Robert Bobel. Bob is one of the leading experts in hybrid Active Directory management and recovery, and with more than 25 years in the Microsoft identity space, he's gained tons of insights and best practices. So you guys are in great hands today. So on that note, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Bob.
Hey, thank you, McKenna. I really appreciate it. Also joining me today is one of my favorite speakers, Brien Posey, and we also have another treat. One of the engineers that works alongside me at Cayosoft, Chad Nichols, is joining us, and I'll be introducing them here in a little bit. But I wanted to start the session out just setting the stage for Brien's portion of the presentation, going back to a simple question, that is, why are groups so darn important? What's the big deal about groups? And then also kind of what makes them really difficult to manage in a Microsoft environment. Now, I should qualify that second statement, that second sentence I made, that what makes them very tough to manage. Creating a group is a very simple process. Adding a user to a group is a very, very simple process. When you get hundreds of groups or thousands of groups, and in some cases, I have been able to see customers or speak with customers who had as many groups or more groups than they had users, it becomes a much more difficult thing to keep it all straight. Each group is a little mini list of people or objects within the environment, and keeping those accurate can be very, very difficult. And the primary reason that we want to keep them accurate is so that we don't have problems with the resources that groups provide access to. So what is that all about? Well, groups are the primary way Microsoft environments grant access to users upon resources. And the big challenge is what's actually going on around us currently. So right now, Active Directory is under just a tremendous amount of pressure from cyber attacks, ransomware attacks, denial of service attacks. And if you look down this brief list, these are, just a handful, literally a handful of the thousands of attacks that were directed either at on-premise Active Directory or at Azure Active Directory, which is obviously Microsoft's cloud and newer version of Active Directory. If I slip and call on-premise Active Directory legacy Active Directory, it's just simply because that was the one that was there and has been there for quite some time. And I heard a quote from Microsoft that something like 98% of businesses worldwide use Active Directory. So we know that this is a huge problem if the groups are part of this cyber attack, and often they are. If somebody breaches the environment, one of the ways that they can start to do things that they shouldn't is escalate their privileges. And one of those ways might be to go and make themselves a member of a privileged group. And so these attacks are something that often lead to a complete failure of your security around your network, or wipe it out completely so it doesn't function. And both of which, those types of outages or those losses of security where intellectual property or money or whatever is stolen, are both very, very damaging in today's business environment. And so they become very, very critical. Groups are one of those components become very, very critical to try and protect. Now, we weren't exactly sure where group management fell in terms of day-to-day administration of Microsoft, either on-premise only, hybrid, or cloud management tasks that people running Active Directory or people that ran IT departments around the world felt it fell in terms of priority. And so we did a study with a group that was acquired by Gartner. It is now part of Gartner Consulting. And we asked them to rank where they felt a lot of time was spent and difficulty in keeping on top of a particular area of IT that they were working on. And so we asked them about provisioning and simplifying their hybrid environment and monitoring across on-premise and cloud. But the number one thing that came back as the most important challenge to the efficiency and security of their IT environment, maintaining accurate group memberships. And we heard about all sorts of crazy schemes people were trying to do that. And so what was very interesting is that actually came even higher than provisioning, and maybe more importantly, the deprovisioning part of accounts. So there's a lot of not just security related concerns about groups and providing people too much access to resources, but a big portion of the compliance regulations that were born in the early 2000s target groups. The owner of a group should, they have to know whether the group has got the accurate membership that they believe it does. They have to know what it grants access to. And then they have to have the business knowledge to understand, how do I apply that group, who gets into it, who doesn't, et cetera. And so as I look down this list, we do a lot of these things at Cayosoft in terms of management, but that number one item, it was number one in the 2000s. It's still number one today, and it's just more complex because the environments are changing. And when I say the environments are changing, what I'm really talking about is hybrid. So where does that fall, and how does that make it more difficult? So also part of what we did in this study is ask, where are you in terms of hybrid? And what we found is the current status was that about 79% of the 300 or 400 people that were part of the study were actually in hybrid and had plans for at least the next 3 years to pretty much do, to continue with hybrid. That's great news for Cayosoft because this is what we do as a company. We build solutions for hybrid management. And you'll see some people are leaving Microsoft. They're going, to other platforms for granting access, and some folks are planning to go cloud over the next 1 to 5 years. But more than half said that they'll be in hybrid indefinitely. Now, my personal belief is that'll shift a little bit. I think that number will go lower. But if you think about the reasons people are in hybrid, is because they can't get rid of legacy Active Directory. And it's typically because they have applications or some other integration with the legacy on-premise directory that just can't be replicated in the cloud, or the applications that they're using can't be used with the cloud. There are also security concerns we've seen, but usually it's a bunch of technology that they took 10 years to implement, and now it's going to take another 10 or 15 to sort of unwind that. So Active Directory for more than half of the enterprises that we see is likely going to be authoritative for the next unforetold number of years. So let's look specifically at a group and figure out what makes it so challenging to keep that up to date. And then we're going to flip over and I'll introduce Brien Posey, and we'll have him go through the specifics, a deep dive on Microsoft groups and some of the individual things that you need to know about those groups. Number one thing with groups is it's a list, and you have to keep that list up to date. And yet people change, right? They get hired, they get fired, they pass away, they retire, they get married and have name changes happening. It's kind of an old-fashioned concept, but we still do it. And then there are other reasons. People get promoted, they get demoted. And each one of those specific points might change something in the environment that requires group memberships to be adjusted. In the old days, back in the 2000s, people were added to groups, but there was never a process to remove them from the group. And so that is a huge challenge. I remember meeting one administrator, and the poor fellow would put into his Outlook calendar a time each day to go out and do just group maintenance. It was crazy. Because of their inaccuracy, groups place not only security but compliance goals in a state where they can be easily compromised. And I can't tell you the number of times I've seen people looking for software solutions because they're compliant, their SOX auditor or the HIPAA auditor or their PCI compliance people came in and said, hey, we found these people, they have access to something they shouldn't, and now you need to find a way to make sure this doesn't happen again, right? So they start looking for solutions to keep these initiatives like security and compliance going the way they should. Hybrid group management gets confusing, and it's basically when hybrid's introduced, it doesn't quite double the workload, but it certainly puts a bigger emphasis on two different distinct directories and how you manage those, and then how you manage the interaction between the two. When I say interaction between the two, I'm talking typically about synchronization. The Microsoft solution called Azure AD Connect, if you're familiar with it, does a great job at taking lists of people in group A on premise and moving them up into the cloud. The challenge becomes you don't just manage the on-premise groups and have everything sync up. It turns out that Microsoft Teams is one of those things that uses groups. You're going to learn about that with Brien in a minute. But you can't really manage team groups on premise, right? So there's some confusion there. There are many, many, many more apps that things like that happen. And again, I'm going to leave that for Brien. A lot of people turn to complex scripts. They download them off the internet. Hopefully somebody who wrote the script as an example really had their act together and understood some of the development fundamentals, and they tested it properly so you don't have problems. A little bit later on, Chad's going to mention a case study and walk you through the details, and it was simply administrator had a rogue script. Group management just ends up becoming time consuming and error prone unless you do things to offload some of the work or to automate the process of maintaining those group memberships. And there are some pretty cool new technologies from Microsoft that we're going to have Brien give you an overview of, and hopefully that eliminates the errors that are just inherent in the process of group management. So with that said, let me introduce Brien. Brien's one of these guys that he's always a magnificent speaker, and he's just an interesting guy. So Brien, please, first of all, if you could just say hello to make sure your microphone's working and everything.
Yes, I'm here. My microphone is working.
Now, Brien, I could read this. You're a Microsoft MVP. You have all these other cool things you're doing, but you have to explain for the audience this picture of you in this bright orange pressure suit. Please tell us.
Yeah, since 2015, I've been training to fly on a space mission to study polar mesospheric clouds. And incidentally, the orange spacesuit isn't the only one that I use. There's also a white EVA suit that I'm training on.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Well, with that, now that everybody knows what's up with the photo, which is a fantastic photo, by the way, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let you walk us through it.
All right. Thank you so much. So yeah, the purpose of this presentation is to talk just a little bit about the way that Microsoft uses groups. And to go back to something that Bob was talking about a moment ago, Azure AD Connect, that's the mechanism that you run on premises to synchronize your on-premises users and groups up to the Microsoft cloud. And it does a really great job, but it's not quite as simple as everybody makes it out to be, because there are some things that you have to think about. For example, do you really want to be having privileged accounts on premises be replicated up to the cloud? That's something that in a lot of cases is disabled by default, and you probably want to leave it that way. Also, as Bob explained, if you work with teams, every time you create a team, a group gets created, and that typically doesn't get sent back down to the on-premises environment. So that's something that you'll have to manage in the Microsoft 365 environment instead. But I don't want to get too far off at a tangent here. The main thing that I want to talk about before we get into the best practices is the various types of groups that are present in a Microsoft environment. Because Microsoft couldn't leave it at, hey, just create a group. There are actually several different types of groups, both on-premises and in the Microsoft 365 cloud. So let's take just a few minutes and talk about some of these different group types. The first type of group, and I'm talking about on-premises groups on this slide, by the way, but the first type of group that you need to know about is a local group. Now, technically, a local group has absolutely nothing to do with Active Directory. Let's say you've got a standalone Windows 10 PC or Windows 11 PC or something like that. You can actually go in on that PC and create a group without that computer even having to be connected to a network if you don't want it to be. And you can use that group to control access to resources on that machine. So that's what local groups are all about. Now, when we start bringing Active Directory into the picture, there are three types of on-premises groups that you'll have to work with: domain local, global, and universal. And these three different groups all serve different purposes, but more importantly, they have different restrictions associated with them. So you kind of have to be careful about what type of group you create for a given situation. So I don't want to go too in depth on these because I know there's a lot of material to cover here, but let's just quickly go over the group types and what some of the restrictions are. So the first type of Active Directory group that's used on premises is a domain local group. And this is used for permission and access control within an Active Directory domain. So let's say you've got a single domain environment, you can create a domain local group, and that group can be used to control access to resources within that domain. So what types of members can this domain local group accommodate? Well, you can have other domain local groups from the same domain. You can have universal groups as group members, and I'll talk about universal groups in a moment. And you can have global groups as a group member in a domain local group, and I'll talk about global groups in just a second too. So you can have users from a domain, and you can have groups from the domain, either global groups or universal groups. So what are global groups? Well, global groups do essentially the same thing as a domain local group, but they're a little bit more powerful, because you can use a global group to grant permission in any domain in the forest in which the group resides. But the caveat to that is that a global group can only include members from the domain where the group exists. So let's say that you've got an Active Directory forest and you've got, I don't know, 10 domains within that forest, and you create a global group inside one of those domains. Well, that global group can be used to grant permissions to resources in any of the other 9 domains, but its membership can only include users from the domain where the group actually exists. Now, the last type of group that you can create on premises is a universal group, and this is by far the least restrictive group type of any of them. And a universal group can be used to grant permissions in any domain in the forest or in a trusting forest. And its membership can include users from any domain in the entire forest, any global group in the forest, or any universal group in the forest. So universal groups are very, very powerful. But having said that, you don't necessarily want to be using universal groups for every situation. If you need to create a group and you can accomplish the goals for that group by using a global group or a domain local group, then you should definitely do that as opposed to using a universal group. Microsoft actually recommends that you use universal groups sparingly. Now, the reason for that is that, let's say you go out and you create a universal group, and then you make a change to that group. Maybe you add a member, you delete a member. Well, when you do that, what that does behind the scenes is it causes the entire global catalog to be replicated across the Active Directory forest. Now, global catalog replication, that's a normal part of Active Directory operations. That in itself isn't necessarily a problem. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But let's say that you've got a situation like the one that Bob described a moment ago, where you've got thousands and thousands of groups and you're constantly making membership changes to those groups. If all of those groups are universal and you've constantly got changes going on, well, that's going to have a huge impact on your Active Directory performance, and that's really not something that you want. So as a best practice, you should definitely use domain local groups or global groups whenever you can, as opposed to using universal groups. Now, that doesn't mean you should shy away from using universal groups if you really need them. It's totally okay to create a universal group. Just try not to go overboard with it if you can keep from doing that.
So, Brian, I have a question. Might be helpful. We just mentioned quickly what the global catalog is. Might be just a nice thing for folks that might not know exactly what that is.
Now, the
What
global catalog
part
is
that
it's
plays.
essentially a database that contains all of the objects from the Active Directory forest, and it gets replicated among the domain controllers so that you can make sure that each domain controller has a consistent copy of everything.
Makes searching much easier across everything too.
Yes.
much easier. Yeah. Okay, great.
So now when we move into the Microsoft 365 environment, we've got completely different types of groups. You still use groups for access control in the Microsoft 365 cloud, but the group types themselves are different from what you have on premises. So you've got two types of groups that you have to worry about in the Microsoft 365 cloud. There are security groups, and that's just a basic group that lets you control access to resources. And then you've got a newer group type. It's not really new at this point, but newer, called a Microsoft 365 group. And a Microsoft 365 group is used to control access to Microsoft 365 resources. I'm talking about things like SharePoint sites and other types of Microsoft 365 structures. So when we start talking about Microsoft 365 groups, group membership can be assigned statically or it can be assigned dynamically. Now, static group assignments is exactly what we've done since the very beginning, even in on-premises environments. You create a group and then an administrator goes out and they pick the users that they want to assign to that group, they make the assignment and call it a day. That's a static group assignment. Now, dynamic group assignment works a little bit differently because rather than an administrator or a group owner having to go in and pick and choose the individual users who will belong to that group, and then later on remove users from that group as needs change, group membership is controlled automatically based on Active Directory attributes. So for example, you might dynamically populate a group membership based on what city a particular user is in or what department a user works in, or any number of other criteria. It's based on Active Directory attributes. So this goes back to what Bob was saying earlier about you've got to make sure that your Active Directory is healthy and that your attributes are what they need to be. Now, dynamic group memberships can be very helpful. They can reduce the administrative workload, but you are going to have to make sure that you've got an Azure AD Premium P1 subscription in order to use that. Another thing that you need to know is that dynamic group assignments can be based on users or they can be based on devices, but you can't do both user and device assignments at the same time within a common group. So let's talk about Active Directory group proliferation, because that's one of the big problems that almost every organization struggles with. Group proliferation is the idea that too many groups get created. Now, obviously, there is a business need for group creation. Groups serve a very useful purpose, but you can end up in situations where your groups just become completely out of control. You've got way more groups than you could ever possibly manage, and it's tough to know what group does what. So proliferation is one of these huge problems that we've got to get a handle on. So the first key to being able to rein in your groups is to figure out where all these groups are coming from. And unfortunately, this is often a very difficult question to answer because groups can be created by a number of different processes. In Microsoft 365, for example, every time you create a SharePoint team site, there's a group that gets created as a part of that process. The same thing goes for Microsoft Teams. Anytime a user creates a new team, there's a group that corresponds to that team that is automatically created. And as a matter of fact, if a user goes in and deletes a team and then later decides that they need to recover that team, that's actually how you get the team back, is you fire up PowerShell, you go in and you undelete that group, and that's what brings back the team. There's a couple of extra steps, but that's the gist of it. Likewise, Microsoft Planner creates groups behind the scenes. If you create a new plan, you don't necessarily have to create a new group. There is an option in Planner to use an existing group, but the default behavior is to create a new group. So very often you'll find that organizations that make heavy use of Microsoft Planner will have a huge number of Planner related groups. And a lot of times those groups stick around even after a plan has completely outlived its usefulness. Also, if you use Staff Hub for the first time, that results in a group being created. So these are just a few examples, but one thing that you have to remember is that if users are authorized to create groups, they can manually create groups within a number of the Microsoft 365 applications. I'm talking about things like Outlook, Power BI, Dynamics 365, and Yammer. Next slide, please. So this raises the question of what are some best practices for group management? How can we rein in that group proliferation and keep it from being so bad? Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is one of those things that's really, really tough to accomplish, especially if your groups are already out of control. Unfortunately, a lot of times the best fix without going to a third-party solution is just a lot of time and hard work invested. And even at that, it can be extremely challenging to rein in that group proliferation. What you can do, however, is you can put some controls in place to help keep your groups from spiraling out of control or to keep the damage from getting worse. So there are a few things that you can do. One thing that you can do is to limit who is allowed to create Microsoft 365 groups. Now, obviously, you don't want to just lock everything down and say, okay, that's it, nobody can create groups, because that's typically going to interfere with users' ability to do their jobs, which is a bad thing. So what you can do is you can figure out who it is that really has a legitimate business need to create groups. And then somewhat counterintuitively, since we're trying to get a handle on groups, you actually go in and create a group of those authorized users. But then Microsoft provides a script called the group creator script. So the group creator script is something that you can download from Microsoft. Just go out to Google or your favorite search engine and search on Microsoft group creator script, and you should be able to find it pretty easily. And then you can run that against the group that you've created and make the necessary permission assignments. Now, another thing that you can do to rein in group proliferation is to put some group naming policies in place. Now, group naming policies aren't going to do anything by themselves to stop group proliferation from happening, because they don't do anything to inhibit groups from being created. What they do, however, is they put some controls in the way that groups are named. So that way, if a group is created and then a couple years later, everybody's trying to figure out what that group does and if it's still needed, the way that that group is named can help provide some clues as to what that group does. So when you go in and you create a group naming policy, you're allowed to define a series of prefixes and suffixes that get appended to the group name. And those prefixes and suffixes get assigned automatically, and they can yield clues as to maybe who created the group or what department the group belongs to. Other attributes that can be associated include things like the company, the office, the state, and the list goes on and on. So essentially, you're taking Active Directory attributes and appending that to the group name. And Microsoft also lets you set up a blocked word list so that way you can stop users from including certain words in group names. So for example, maybe you don't want users appending HR to the name of a group, especially if they don't actually work in HR, or you can prevent words such as CEO or official and things like that. Now, one other thing that you can do is set up a Microsoft 365 group expiration policy. The basic idea behind a group expiration policy is that after a certain length of time, unless a group is renewed, it just goes away. So that way you're essentially expiring old groups, and that can cut down on group proliferation. Now, as you can imagine, this is one of those things that you have to be really, really careful with using, because you don't want a group to just automatically expire if it's still being used. The good news is that there are some safeguards in place to keep that from happening. Because when a group is coming up for expiration, its owner has a chance to renew that group. And if the group is something that's being very actively used, then it can even renew without the owner even having to do anything, which is really helpful because you may have some group owners that own a lot of groups, and you don't want to overburden those group owners with constantly having to renew groups. So what do I mean when I say that if a group is being actively used, then it can automatically renew? Well, Microsoft has a lot of really specific criteria for what will initiate an automatic renewal of a group. But in most cases, just regular day-to-day use of whatever resource in Microsoft 365 is tied to that group is going to be enough. Now, the required usage varies because viewing a SharePoint site alone won't cause the group associated with that site to be renewed. You have to be actively engaging with that site, not just viewing a page. Incidentally, whenever a group does expire, any services that are associated with that group also go away. And I'm talking about things like mailboxes, SharePoint sites, planner plans, Teams, and that sort of thing. Now, what happens if a group is accidentally expired? Maybe the group owner was on vacation or taking an extended leave and just didn't get around to renewing that group. Well, when that happens, the group is soft deleted. So that means that at that point, all of those services go away, but the owner has 30 days to go in and undelete that group, and then that will put everything back to the way that it was. So I've already taken up quite a bit of time. I know there were some other speakers. So Bob?
Hey, Brian, thank you so much for that. I think that was a great overview of what to look out for to at least get a deep understanding of sort of what's going on premise and now with the cloud. And these topics are kind of like onions. You peel back the surface, and there's 50 more layers here. So very good. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. So I just wanted to mention that we are working, for those of you who are viewing this live, we will do a attendance check here in a moment to get the list of folks that will be entered into the drawing for the Amazon gift card that was mentioned at the very beginning. If you're viewing this on demand, we apologize, but one of the benefits that we do is after you've signed up for one of our live webinars, we announce that we give a gift card away to encourage final attendance, which is always a big challenge. Next up, one of my senior engineers here at Cayosoft, Chad Nichols. Chad is one of those guys that you find out in the world, you bring them into your company, and you never have a second thought about making that decision. Chad's been with companies like JP Morgan, Hexion, and has had the dubious distinction of also having gone through some of the bigger problems around group management, loss of groups, loss of directories, things like that. So he has quite a bit of experience here. And I asked him to come in and talk to us about a case study for one of our customers. Actually, the case study happened right before they became a customer. We happened to be in proof of concept with them. So I'm going to have him go through that. And then I asked him to do just a very brief overview of how we enhance the Microsoft native tools around the recycle bin, which Brien was talking about. You have that soft delete. We have some tools that help with that, undelete and extend that to a restoration of the objects. And then also to do a very brief demonstration of some of the automations that we provide, maybe a little similar to what Microsoft provides, but there are some clear benefits that I think a lot of people will recognize pretty quickly. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chad.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. So let's go over the healthcare study that Bob mentioned a minute ago. So we had a healthcare organization that was in proof of concept with us for our Guardian product, which is the product we have that monitors changes, and you can also use it to recover those changes very easily. And they had a engineer that ran a script and accidentally targeted the wrong group. And we're all human, it happens, we've all done it. But in this case, it happened to be a group that was both manually managed and also gave the licensing, assigned the licensing for their first responders. So, they discovered the issue when doctors and nurses started calling in and saying, hey, I no longer have access to Teams, to email, to my documents and everything within the Microsoft environment. And so what they did was, even though they were just in the POC, one of the things that we pride ourselves in is our support. And one of our engineers got on the phone with them and helped them to troubleshoot what had happened. And I'm actually going to come over and change this to my screen so I can show you guys exactly what occurred and how we helped them to resolve that issue. So when this occurred, they had limited time. This is something that's very crucial in the real world. If you don't have a product like this, chances are you're going to have to do some kind of a system state restore. And even then, if you get back the Active Directory from the last backup, there's going to be changes that have occurred potentially to those groups, the ones especially that are maintained manually. So what you need is a way to recover those more instantaneously, and then also a way to really track those changes to, not just groups, but honestly any object in the directory, both on-prem and in Azure, in real time, and then be able to respond to those. So for instance, before we got on here, I went ahead and removed the members for one of my licensing groups, and So I'm going to say that we basically are doing the same kind of troubleshooting. So Alan calling in, and he wants to know, what happened. So here is a change from him. Looks like he was removed from this licensing E3 licensed users group. Now, before I actually just go in and make a change, I want to make sure that that's correct. So, let's look at someone else. So let's see who else was affected. Alice, and let's take a look at the last change for AD for her. And it looks like she was removed from the same group. So based on this, I have a pretty good understanding of what happened. And now I can go back to the original group change, search for that. So here's the last on-prem change. Notice I also picked up the synchronization change because AD Connect is doing that for me. But the change occurred on-prem, so I want to make sure that I'm looking at the right thing. So here's a list of all the members that were removed. Granted, my group is a small list of users, but in this case, when you have thousands of users that are removed from a group that's manually maintained, to say this could be a lengthy and cumbersome, if not near impossible, task is putting it mildly. So with our product, all they had to do was go back to the original change, do the rollback action, which is basically going to undo the change that occurred. And then if I go back and look at my group, now I can see all the members have been restored. Traditional tools, not much help here. This is not a deletion for the recycle bin that it would track. So this is a change that is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to troubleshoot, especially have a really, really large environment. So like I've said, they quickly saw the value of the tool when this occurred, and they became a customer shortly thereafter. So we also mentioned deletions. Those are also things that occur, and maybe you have a team deletion or an on-prem deletion, like was mentioned just a moment ago, and you need to recover that. That is something you can use native tools for, but some of the process of doing that is a little bit cumbersome. It takes some expertise, because not only do you have the recycle bin to take care of, but what about all of the objects that were linked to those deleted objects? So in the case of a user, you have group memberships, you have manager information, and the same with groups or computers and all of those types of objects. You're going to have those linked objects that are part of that deletion. So with our tool, we're going to track everything that occurs during a deletion process, because it's not only the group change, but it's also going to be, in this case, the user object change. So you're going to see both of those types of changes. If there was manager information, you're going to see that. So really, and actually that is part of it. So here's the manager information. So you're going to see everything, every attribute changed for all the objects that are affected by this. And then what this allows us to do is, if I roll back this action, this is going to bring this out of the recycle bin. So if I come in here and refresh, now I'm going to have my group back, but also the members are automatically relinked. The manager information is restored. If this were a member of another group, that information would be restored. If it were a user object or computer object or the other types of objects that has those linked objects, those would also be recovered. And to go a little bit further, just as a high level, this product has a SQL backend to record all of these changes. So what does that allow me to do? Let's say I have gone 181 days or 91 days, whatever your recycle bin policy is, and this object has basically been removed from the recycle bin, so it can no longer be brought back that way. We can actually still recover it because we know all of the information and everything that was done for that change. In this case, it would be a new object, so you'd have a new sitter of good, but all of the attribute information, all the memberships, everything about that object would be restored. So this is a great way to handle those instantaneous type of restores. And before I switch over to some of our management tools, Bob, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that's pretty good. I think the only thing I would mention is that the change audit record here, this change history, is showing me both my on-premise objects and my cloud objects. And so one of the most important reasons that we do restore everything fully is because we do a full hybrid restore if the object is hybrid. And that includes calling Azure AD Connect. So if I delete an on-premise user and that gets replicated to the cloud, or a group that gets replicated to the cloud, or I just change the membership inappropriately on-premise, when we do our restores, we can also then call Azure AD Connect and make sure that that data is transmitted or synchronized up to Azure, so that we've made a full restore of that information, not just the on-premise piece, and then you have to wait an hour or 30 minutes till your sync cycle comes around.
Cool, thank you. So now let's talk about some of the administrative challenges. So the other tool we have called Cayosoft Administrator is all around helping you administrate your environment. Again, hybrid, cannot stress that enough. We can definitely do on-prem only, we can do cloud only, but the sweet spot where most people are today is you definitely hybrid. So we can help you with that management and help you delegate out access to help allow end users, managers of groups, and different people do different things in a very controlled way. Because, you know, one of the things that can be a pain is when you don't have proper naming conventions, proper standards followed. So any way that you can leverage a product to ensure that your naming conventions are followed and all of those things are repeatable, it just helps take some of the human equation out of it, because you know everybody does things differently, and you know everybody makes mistakes. So the best way to do that is to try to eliminate that as much as possible. You can never do it wholly, but for example, this user I'm logged in with here is an engineering manager, and I've given him access to see his engineering teams. So with this, if he wanted to, he could update the membership of this team and do some limited interaction with the team. He can't create new teams, he can't delete teams, so he's really limited in what he can do. Now, that being said, when you have a team as big as this, that's not something you typically want to maintain. So you want to be able to control membership very easily and very repeatably. And to do that, we have what's called dynamic groups. This is a very simple way to put that membership criteria around your group membership and set a rule. And then when somebody meets the criteria, they're added to the group. When they do not meet that criteria, they're removed. It's very straightforward. And this is an amazing way to reduce help desk tickets. People, as they change positions, change locations, you always have those additional group ads that are requested. But like was mentioned previously, you know, when you have somebody that's been somewhere for a long period of time, they're going to be members of a lot of groups they no longer need. And then you start getting into Kerberos ticket bloat, things take longer to log in, and it's just a mess. So you don't want to have to do that any more than possible. I do want to mention though, not only can you do that criteria, but one big difference that we have versus Microsoft with our dynamic group solution is if you're populating cloud groups, you actually do not have to update AD Connect replication to add the extra attributes to do dynamic groups in the cloud. We allow you to directly query on-prem AD for managing cloud groups, and that doesn't matter if it's a team group, an office group, an office security group, whatever that group type is, because there's a lot of companies that those organizations are different, right? This folks that manage the cloud teams don't necessarily have access to update Active Directory Connect, and then you have longer times that you have to wait for things to get done, and it can be a mess. But with our solution, you don't have to deal with that. You do these things directly. We also have restricted groups where you can control access, define eligible members. Also, that's where our time-based membership exists. Family groups where you set criteria around naming convention, and then once a specific type of attribute is created, it will automatically create and populate the group for you. Approval processes that are built into the software. So if there are groups that you can't dynamically manage, but they need to be, they're needed to be permission based, we can set those groups up to do that, and then the appropriate person has to grant access. Those are great for those licenses in the office like Visio, Project, that really cost extra money, and so you want a director or somebody that writes the checks to do those approvals. Also, group attestation. So if you have compliance groups that you need to do audits on a regular basis, you can make sure that that's done. It's all automated and everything's done for you via the tool. So there are many ways that we can help with the group management, and I would definitely love to be able to show anyone that's interested more detail around that. But I think as far as that goes, for myself, that pretty much takes my time. Make sure that you guys, if you have any questions, just reach out and we'll be happy to answer those. Bob, anything else you want to
No, Chad,
mention
thank
before?
you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yep, no
I
problem.
think that gives everybody more than enough to sort of understand what we're doing. So
Cool.
Good. So I'm going to flip back over just to sort of give you a high level view of what we do. We provide management, monitoring, and recovery for hybrid Active Directory, including Azure. You can turn off legacy Active Directory and continue to work with Cloud Directory as well. Okay, so at this point, we're going to take attendance. So McKenna, if you could grab the snapshot, I'd appreciate it. And again, this is for a $50 Amazon card.
All right. We've got attendance taken. So if you are the lucky winner, we'll go ahead and reach out to you after the call to get your information. So make sure you're looking out for that. We'd like to thank everyone for their time today. Hope you enjoyed the webinar. You'll see a few quick links for our Cayosoft website. Should you have any additional questions, you'll see that Cayosoft /question. We also have links there for a personalized demo that Chad was talking about, or a trial or request pricing. And of course, if you have any questions and you want some additional information about Cayosoft and our solutions, feel free to visit the website, cayosoft.com. Again, thank you guys so much for your time and have a great day.